Welcome to Brussels Forum 2020. We are pleased to introduce the President of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, Dr. Karen Donfried.
A warm welcome to all of you from DC. Today is a big day as we bring to a close our month-long, first ever virtual Brussels Forum. It turned out to be a great way to mark the forum's 15th anniversary during a pandemic. I am indebted not only to my amazing colleagues and our impressive speakers for this edition of Brussels Forum, but also to our partners. Many thanks to our founding partners, Daimler and the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, our forum partner, Deloitte, and all of our associate, supporting, and knowledge partners. It is these wonderful partners who make Brussels Forum possible. Brussels Forum has been an extraordinary month-long festival of ideas. We've looked at many of the pressing challenges facing the transatlantic relationship. And to close out this month, we want to turn to the foundation of alliance, namely trust. Given the pandemic, along with challenges from China and Russia, we at GMF believe it is more important than ever for the transatlantic community to act with common purpose to address these challenges. That said, in many instances, we have different perspectives and different policy prescriptions within the transatlantic partnership on everything from climate to Iran. To bridge those policy differences, a foundation of trust among partners is essential. Thus, we are particularly concerned about the pronounced erosion of trust among allies, as well as within our own societies. There's a growing desire for security, for protection, for certainty, because of the unpredictability of our times, which is leading to a growing sense of vulnerability. That brings me to this panel. To discuss this difficult and critical set of issues around trust and resilience in times of crisis, I have four terrific speakers who bring distinct perspectives. Let me introduce my panel. We have Congressman Mike Turner, who, after having served as the mayor of Dayton, Ohio, was first elected to the House of Representatives in 2002 and serves as a subcommittee chairman on the House Armed Services Committee and is a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. In Marc Morial, we have another former mayor. He was mayor of New Orleans, Louisiana. He is now the president and CEO of the National Urban League, the largest historic civil rights and urban advocacy organization in the United States. Sylvie Goulard is Deputy Governor of the Banque de France and a former Minister of the Armed Forces in the government of President Macron. She has deep background and experience in the European Union, including having served as a member of the European Parliament. Rosa Balfour is Director of Carnegie Europe, and meaningfully for me, a former colleague here at GMF. She too has deep expertise on European politics and institutions. Welcome and thanks to all four of you. For those of you who are listening, I am keen to include your questions in this session. So please send them in via Twitter, hashtag is Brussels Forum, or you can email brusselsforum@gmfus.org. So please do send in those questions. Now to this issue of trust. I wanted to begin the conversation with you, Marc Morial. You have spoken eloquently about how Black Americans are contending with the devastating impact of two viruses, coronavirus and racism. So to what extent do you believe that Black Americans have lost trust in our healthcare system and in our police? And what does the path to restoring trust look like in that context?
Well, let me first of all thank you, and I'm just honored to be a part of a very distinguished panel today, and also to continue our working relationship with the German Marshall Fund, which contributed through its Transatlantic Democracy Alliance tremendous research to our 2019 State of Black America report, which chronicled the history and the magnitude of Russian interference, particularly Russian voter suppression of African American voters in the 2016 election. In many respects, both COVID and the recent incidents of police brutality laid bare what has been a reality for Black Americans for a long time. The existence of health disparities is of a long-standing nature. The differences in access to health care, the differences in death rates between Blacks and whites in America, the affordability differences in terms of the ability to afford the very best health care. All of these issues point to a disparity between health outcomes, health access between Black and white Americans. What COVID did is it made it real, and it also made it deadly because of the 2-to-1 ratio of African Americans dying vis-a-vis white Americans. In the policing area, it's been a long road, and a particularly difficult road for Black Americans since 2013, when Trayvon Martin, a teenager down in Florida, was killed by a so-called night watchman or a volunteer security guard, George Zimmerman. The George Floyd incident shocked the nation and the world, because what technology means is many of these incidents of police brutality, police abuse, police unnecessary use of force are being captured on tape. And it no longer is a situation where it's one person's word, in some instances, against a dead person's word. It's well-meaning citizens, it's body cams, it's security cameras catching these incidents, and thus people can make their own mind up whether their sensibilities are affected. And in George Floyd, the nation saw a man die before their very eyes due to, if you will, police misconduct. And the man died, and the man was essentially murdered on the streets of a great American city. What does it take to rebuild trust? Well, trust has been eroded by the way in which the national government has handled both of these incidents. Number one, not acknowledging the disparities in a very upfront way, acknowledging the severity of COVID on a consistent basis. And in the police brutality sense, the current administration here in Washington, their Justice Department policy walked back some of the slow progress that had been made under President Obama in using the law to investigate pattern and practice violations by police departments. So for us, trust is built through meaningful policy change, not just conversations and words, but meaningful policy change. In the policing area, those changes are going to have to take place at the national level and also at the state level and at the municipal level in what I like to think of as reimagination and reforming of policing. When it comes to COVID, the entire focus of how we rebuild the nation's public health systems, which this COVID pandemic demonstrated were weak and underinvested in, notwithstanding the hard work of many and the diligence and the commitment of so many frontline health workers. How do we rebuild that health system, the public health system, in a way that addresses disparities and not rebuild it the same way it was before? So for Black Americans, it's going to take substantive change. The protests that are taking place in this nation now are very different than many protests, because the multiracial, multi-generational nature of the protests and the outrage, with 70% of Americans supporting the aims of the Black Lives Matter movement has stunned most political observers. It's not stunned me, though, because I believe that the people in this nation, when confronted with unvarnished facts about a challenge and a problem, and structural and institutional racism is a challenge and a problem, they will respond, and they want leaders who respond. So we're at that moment now where I think the people want meaningful and substantive change. The only question is whether the elected officials will follow the people.
Interesting. So my takeaway is the way to rebuild trust is through meaningful and substantive policy change. And you're an interesting person to speak to this because you both have been an elected leader and now you're running an advocacy organization. So we may come back to that. I want to now turn to Rosa Balfour because you have focused on the relationship on the other side of the Atlantic between domestic politics and Europe's global role. And I wanted to ask you to use the example of Italy to ask how the European Union can restore the trust of Italian citizens when during the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic in Italy, citizens there felt abandoned by the European Union. So if the European Union does not have the trust of its citizens at home, can it be effective abroad? So Rosa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you for inviting me. It's a delight to be back at Brussels Forum and in the GMF family. Italy is indeed a very good example. Probably never before the opinion poll ratings for the current government were so high at the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak and quite so low for Europe. Italy has been the country which has had where the government has enjoyed very little trust on part of its citizens, and the EU used to enjoy a lot of trust. And this relationship has gone the other way. It's happened over time. There was first disillusionment over the Eurozone crisis, disillusionment about what the EU was doing on migration issues. But it's quite unusual that the government and the Prime Minister in particular enjoyed quite so much trust. It is volatile though. And that trust, both at the national level and at the EU level, needs to be built again. And there's several things that need to be done in this regard. And I'm particularly happy that we started talking about local, because I think what the whole coronavirus pandemic has shown throughout Europe is the importance of local services, the importance of local responses, the importance of mayors and representatives being with citizens and organizing all those community initiatives that have really supported people throughout the pandemic. And if you look at Italy, there are two examples on the health front. Health is decentralized regionally in Italy. And you have one region, which is Lombardy, and another region, which is Veneto. Both in the north, both very wealthy, both very well connected, hence, amongst the first regions to be exposed to the coronavirus. And one of those regions has responded very well and has managed to contain the virus, and the health services, whilst under pressure, have managed to weather the crisis, and the other region has not. So this shows that the quality of local services is actually critical for trust. So what I think is important to think about, and I think this is valid in the US as much as it is in Europe, how democracies can rebuild trust with their societies at the local level and at the national level, and of course at the European level. Now, at the EU level, the initial response was cacophonous. Member states closed their borders. I mean, the free market, the single market was the holy grail of European integration, and member states unilaterally closed their borders. But I think after a few weeks, the EU institutions, their response started to kick in. And now, following this Franco-German agreement on the recovery fund proposal, EU institutions themselves are also listened to a bit more. So member states are actually coordinating their position on travel. There's a lot more coordination taking place. So it looks like the crisis management machinery has moved faster than, say, in 2010 or 2015, when again, Europe was hit by major crises. This is the first step in rebuilding trust at a European level. But there are other things that need to be taken into account. And I would say the one beyond moving forward on the recovery fund and on the budget negotiations, which are going to take place next week already, and I'm sure Sylvie Goulard will say more about this. But in addition to the economic recovery, which is something citizens clearly care about, for the EU to be able to have the trust of its citizens, it also needs to work in parallel on other fronts, which are critical. And one is democracy. The Conference on the Future of Europe will start in September. It is absolutely vital that the EU continues this process of engaging with citizens about what Europe should be about. And it is also critical that the EU takes into account the consequences of what is happening in countries where democracy is rolling back. We just had presidential elections in Poland. It's very likely that Poland will follow the Hungarian path of dismantling many of its democratic institutions and the rule of law. So the EU needs to keep an eye on this and make sure it reverses these processes. And the third area, referring to foreign policy, Europe's global role, Europe is increasingly divided in foreign policy and increasingly unable to address concerns which are becoming close to home. Just look at what's happening in Libya. And these three, in my view, these three strands are interconnected. The first is making sure the economy does not plunge into a recession, and that the recovery fund is actually meaningful for the citizens. But the other is also to keep unity on the democratic front, and that means also the quality of democracy. And the third front is foreign policy, because the Europe is immersed in a global world where distances have shortened, and the coronavirus has shown this. I'd just like to make one point, if I may, Karen, on the transatlantic relationship, because I've found that there are many parallels between Europe and the US in terms of how it's dealt with the pandemic, but there are also huge differences. And we know that politically, the transatlantic relationship has been under huge strain and is likely to continue to be under strain at least until the next presidential elections in the US. But it really struck me how Europeans went out to protest for Black Lives Matter. And it felt, the feeling I had, despite the fact that the histories are different. I mean, of course, there's a big European responsibility in slavery, but in Europe, the debates about diversity are somewhat different. The history of ethnic minorities and their role in society is different from the US, but there was a very strong feeling of a community. And so I feel there is a strong bottom-up community of people, individuals who are willing to mobilize, to voice their complaints in a spirit of empathy, but also of recognition that each country has its own history and has its own specific problems. So I think it's been absolutely fascinating from this point of view to see a community of citizens across the two sides of the Atlantic, which is not matched at the moment by politics.
And it reminds us of those shared values that underline the relationship around small L liberal democracy and freedom of speech and the right to protest. That's a great point. I want to follow up now by going to Sylvie Goulard to ask about trust between countries. And you know the Franco-German relationship so well. And on the one hand, it seemed as though there was real exasperation between Paris and Brussels on many issues until we saw President Macron and Chancellor Merkel reach a striking agreement last month on a 500 billion euro coronavirus recovery fund. And that agreement is now at the core of the even larger European Commission recovery plan. Most observers have seen Germany as the one compromising here because the Germans for so long opposed giving grants to needier European Union member states rather than loans. And so, Sylvie, I'd really be interested in your sense of what changed in Berlin, or what allowed Macron and Merkel to reach such an important decision together.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for giving me the floor in this panel. I'm glad to participate in this discussion. And I wanted to come back to Marc's sentence on meaningful and substantive policy changes. I think that whatever you are discussing with citizens, the most important thing is not to deliver blah blah and speeches, but to deliver concrete political steps. And here I must confess that I really warmly welcome this common step by the French and the Germans. Of course, France and Germany are not the only member states in the European Union, so it's great that the Commission now is handling the proposal and there will be a decision. But once again, I really believe, first of all, it was important to show to the citizens, and for this reason, it's important to decide quickly that things are moving in a very specific way, that the European Union is providing help. And I must confess that after some cacophony, as Rosa said, we took also huge decisions on the monetary side, on the prudential side, and even the Commission took some steps. I really feel we should all be very humble. All people in leading positions now, we are facing such an unprecedented crisis that, of course, one could always wish it's quicker, it's better done, but here we are. These steps are now in front of us. As Rosa stressed, even sometimes from a region to another, there were huge differences. So it's not just the local level or the national level, it's the good policy, the fact that you deliver these meaningful and substantive changes or not. So here we are. So it's a good signal to show that France and Germany consider that the euro is there to stay, that the single market is there to stay. And Rosa, if I may, I don't know if you noticed, during the lockdown, I was fascinated that when you go to a supermarket, all the European goods were circulating. Mm-hmm. So the borders were closed for people, but we managed to keep the borders. I could buy mozzarella di bufala campana in Paris, or so many other Italian products, for example, in the food shops. So we cannot say we are at the end of the process. Europe is an unfinished business, it's clear. I've seen many articles in America on the Hamiltonian moment we would be in. Well, I think it's difficult to compare. At the time of Hamilton, you had a common debt, but no financial markets. So the situation is a little bit more complex now. But one of the Hamiltonian steps was already when we created the euro. We went through a very difficult financial crisis. Now we are facing a sanitary one. Measures are taken. I'm not saying it's enough. We have to make sure that all member states can agree and of course, improve the proposal made by France and Germany and by the Commission. And at the heart of any work on trust, you have to be serious in your proposals to implement them. But I wanted to add something. It's also very important to have some rules and stick to the rules. And here, of course, the Germans compromised, and it's positive, and we can thank them for that. But they are also benefiting a lot from the single market, as we are. They are benefiting a lot from the euro, from the free movement of people, for the workforce, for the peace around. So you can look at all this as someone making just auditing and accounting and say, well, how much money do I put in the pot and how much money do I get back? Or you can try to evaluate all the benefits each member state is drawing from belonging to this common project. And my very last point will be on Italy and elsewhere. The funny thing is that the paradox was that some Eurosceptics were the ones criticizing the most the European Union for not acting. You had the nationalists criticizing Europe, although they are always refusing European intervention. So maybe at the end, I hope that there is not a new second wave. At the end of all this, we will be in the position to better evaluate. Maybe some populists and some nationalists will be also the victims of the coronavirus.
Interesting. So, Congressman Turner, we've heard now we need to rebuild trust by meaningful policy change. Rosa was saying, if you're talking about a pandemic, it's really the quality of local services that lead to trust in a pandemic. We just heard from Sylvie Goulard, politicians need to deliver. I have to say, this is making me think about Congress, because often in the United States, when we talk about the loss of trust among Americans, growing societal divides, the polarization, many point to the political polarization in the US Congress as Exhibit A. Is that fair? Do you see a loss of trust there?
Well, I think certainly there's been a partisan tenor that has been incredibly unfortunate. But if you look at the actual work that comes out of Congress, especially with respect to the pandemic, we had, the Treasurer Mnuchin coming forward with what was a very thoughtful package, and Congress on a bipartisan basis overwhelmingly adopting it. Now, there are partisan bills that are here and there coming out of the House now that are more messaging statements, not real work, but are the type of work that allows them to frame what their policy issues are. But if you look at what was done in the CARES Act, we did direct aid to hospitals who were under stress and strain, both for not having elective surgeries and also for the COVID virus itself. We did aid directly to individuals. People were losing their jobs. They needed immediately cash to be able to eat. And then we extended unemployment, including recognizing that there are going to be increased expenses as we all go to this new environment we're trying to operate in. And then secondly, on the economic side, we went directly and gave aid to small businesses so they could keep their payrolls going. That certainly was overwhelmingly bipartisan. So I think, sometimes we sell ourselves short on that. But Karen, first off, let me thank you and GMF for your continued support of the Brussels Forum. You've been the place where we all come together on an annual basis and reflect on what's happening in the world and what do we need to do? What is our agenda? How is it reflecting out in real things? And here we are in COVID, and you're having us in a virtual sense come together to continue that discussion. I wanted to go back for just a minute on what Rosa had said on the fact that Black Lives Matter had demonstrations throughout the West, and there was a recognition of this concern. As Marc Morial, and I have a great deal of respect for Marc, both having been a hands-on mayor. He's actually, had a leadership position, and then his advocacy positions that he had through mayor's position, and now he's a very strong and thoughtful voice. I enjoyed working with him when we were both mayors at the U.S. Conference of Mayors. The numbers that he was reflecting on minority effects of COVID, the UK is experiencing the same. So it really is, I think, a reflection of the West on what needs to be done on the issue of healthcare. If you look at UK, both for African descent and for minorities, their numbers are the same as ours. This is going to take additional thought. But I do think that the transatlantic alliance is incredibly strong in this. If you notice that even though there's, on the economic side, there's strain from the national security side, international security side, we've done a very good job of ensuring that there's continuity. Whenever you have this level of uncertainty, both on the pandemic side, but also on the economic side, you can have adventuresomeness of some of our adversaries. And in this, because the transatlantic alliance is so strong on international security, you're not seeing that. You're seeing it break out in some places, but people are not trying to take advantage, our adversaries not trying to take advantage of it in a way that they could because of our strength together.
And that's an interesting point too, because when we look at foreign policy in Congress, some of those partisan divisions become more obvious, but we actually don't see them with regard to Europe. And I'm struck by the broad bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate for NATO. Just share with us your sense of the view on the Hill of our European allies.
Absolutely, it's very strong. Support for NATO is incredibly strong, and since Congress is meeting less, since we've been doing some virtual meetings on the security side and on the intelligence side, what you're seeing is that there are fewer bills moving through Congress. So a lot of the work has to get done on a bipartisan basis, and I think that has helped us. And you're certainly going to see it this week as we move forward with the National Defense Authorization Bill. This is a bill that we've worked on remotely, but there's going to be great consensus. Last year, when we were all together and spent months and months and months working together on the bill, there was significant partisan squabbling. This year, we're coming together because we know when we're together, we have to get our work done. You're seeing much more bipartisan work, and certainly you see a continuation of our strong support for our European allies and for NATO.
Thanks. And I want to, it's great that you picked up Rosa's point about the solidarity we've seen across the Atlantic when it comes to Black Lives Matter. And I'm interested in asking maybe you, Marc Morial, how you see that. I mean, what's the basis for that solidarity across the Atlantic? And do you see an opportunity for building that kind of trust, not only here in the US, but a broader transatlantic solidarity around these issues?
Well, yeah, thank you very much. So the United States is undergoing a significant demographic shift. By 2040, maybe 2045, the United States will not have a majority ethnic group. It'll be a country made up of whites, Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans as the four largest ethnic groups. And it will be the first time in American history where you do not have a majority ethnic group. The signals towards that are now at the age of 17, 18-year-olds and under in the United States are half white and half non-white. So those demographic shifts are creating both opportunities and also frictions, and also a wake-up call and a reality that this nation has got to change. It's got to transform itself so that the new emerging communities, African Americans and Latinos, are not left out of the economic mainstream or continue to be left out of the economic mainstream in this country. I think Europe, and I saw this when I visited the UK about 15, 18 years ago, is also seeing demographic changes, albeit people from Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Middle East, who are now growing parts of the populations of Europe. And so it puts into play in Europe issues of economic social disparity. It puts into play the hierarchy of power in Europe. And so Europe is beginning to see a number of the challenges when nations and societies cities become more economically and more racially diverse. I think the entire Black Lives Matter movement and the international dimension of it is also sending a message to leaders. And that is a message that we don't like hate speak. We don't like leaders that build their careers on demagoguery and division. We believe that that is inconsistent with the kind of nations and communities that we want to build. So to some extent, the protests in the street are the voices of people who feel like they're not being heard at the ballot box, people who feel like they're not being heard at the highest councils of decision making. And it also reflects the fact that it is important for the United States and its traditional allies in Europe to work more closely together. One thing that's been missing is at the highest levels, there does not, to the eye of observers, appear to be a coordinated, if you will, collaborative effort between the leaders in Europe and the President of the United States to understand that the pandemic is not a pandemic of one nation. It's a pandemic with a global dimension. And how are these nations working together? How are these leaders collaborating? How are they communicating on a consistent basis? And I think that the support for the Black Lives Matter movement reflects a reality about all of the above, and a real wake-up call that large segments of communities, not just African Americans, want the United States to move in a direction that is very different from its past. And I think you begin to see the very same thing occurring in Europe. And it's important for leaders to understand the nature of these protests. I've been to probably 4 of the protests in Washington and Philadelphia and in the New York area. And I'm struck by the wide dimension of people who are participating. And yeah, look, there's some people protesting inappropriately, but 99%, 95 to 98% of the people that I see are there peacefully. They're there with purpose. They're there because they want reforming in policing, reforming in criminal justice, policies that promote economic equity. So we've got to understand that this is a watershed moment of a global dimension, and the pandemic, because it's caused so much pain, death, and loss of jobs, and a decline in business activity. Many small businesses will not make it through this, is also raising people's consciousness about issues, I think, of racial injustice and economic inequality in a very different way.
And I want to bring Sylvie Goulard in here because I know that France has been one of the countries where there has been real solidarity around this issue of Black Lives Matter. And to Marc's point about economic inequality, I mean, is there an opportunity to use the fallout of the pandemic to think about putting in place policies that also get at those underlying issues of inequality, if you want to speak to that?
Well, first of all, I support Marc in this idea of a democratic shift in all our countries. The perception of ourselves is very different from what you experience when you take the tube in Paris or where you are in the streets. So our populations are mixed. And there is an economic dimension, but in 2 senses. First of all, we have maybe more transfers in France than in the US. The health system is, there is access for everyone. So we have a lot to do to give equal opportunities. I'm not saying we have reached any ideal situation, but the truth is that first of all, I agree that this pandemic, and we experienced this in France some years ago with the terrorist attacks as well. People realize what globalization means. I mean, it's not possible anymore to think, okay, I close myself in my borders and everything will be fine. Protection is a legitimate wish from the population, but the answer is not that simple that you put only your nation first, or that you want to, once again, close yourself in a kind of castle, and it's not possible anymore. It was true for terrorism. We experience this now with the pandemic. It is also true for climate change, which is a real risk in front of us and an irreversible one, on which we also have to reinvent international cooperation. And my very last point is that there is something we should sell in a positive way, which is that when you have so many people not having the opportunities they could have, or they are entitled to have according to the law, not only you sanction them for just being what they are, which is unacceptable in a democracy, but it's not the optimal use of resources of the nation and of the country. So it's in everybody's interest. And that's the reason why I see with great admiration that so many white people or Latinos or whatever consider that it is their business, exactly like women appreciate when men engage themselves for gender equality. It's very important, it's very positive, and the American society is giving an image of what Tocqueville would have written again, that you have a real civil society, you have some checks and balances coming from the press, from the freedom, and we should believe much more in our own values. The values we share in Europe and in the US is that you can also express that you disagree with some policies and you have the hope to change them through the next elections.
We've got lots of questions coming in, and I want to weave together 2 questions from anonymous writers and ask them of you, Rosa. There's one question that says, if Trump is reelected in November, will we have gone past the time where rebuilding trust with US allies is possible? And then we have another question, which is, for our European allies, how can we manage the inevitably unrealistic expectations that if Vice President Biden is elected, the US-Europe alliance will be miraculously fixed? Rosa, can you speak to those questions?
Yes, I think there is a trend, and beyond who's in power, the trend is that the US would like Europe to take a bigger role in managing its own security and managing its foreign policy. And that trend is there to stay, regardless of who's going to be the next US president. I think for Europe, Europe has been very slow at responding. There's a bit of a path dependency on the transatlantic relationship, and NATO, of course, remains the core of this. And it is absolutely critical that at least the NATO dimension is reinforced by both sides. But I think in Europe, there has been a shift in the debate. And in a way, the free fall of the US-China relationship since the outbreak of the pandemic has actually strengthened the determination of Europeans to look at foreign policy with a sharper focus. The problem is that on foreign policy matters, Europeans have really been quite hopelessly divided. And the closer to home the problem, the more divided they seem to be, which is why I was insisting on this sort of three-pronged approach to looking at how Europe can reinvent itself. The first, of course, is the recovery fund and the idea of delivering better policies closer to the people and addressing the inequality and lack of convergence amongst the economies, which was present since the Eurozone. But the second is democracy, because, and I think we've all been talking about this demand coming from citizens. It's about different political processes. It's not just about delivering better policies. It's also about political participation. It's about involving. It's about inclusivity, and that's been missing. And that's why we need to keep that dimension active. We need to act on different levels. And finally, the foreign policy piece, precisely because the transatlantic relationship is so brittle, and precisely because the demands on Europeans, whoever's going to be in the White House after the elections, the demand for Europe is actually to take a greater role, a greater responsibility. And that trend is there. Europe will be messy and will continue to appear divided, but there are areas in which it can actually make a difference internationally. And it's less about conflict close to home. It's more about trade. It's more about regulation. The Green Deal. There's several areas where Europe can make a difference, and providing that they keep in check these areas of activity, it is achievable.
Thanks, and Congressman Turner, you're welcome to speak to this as well, but I wanted to ask you another question that's come in from the audience. This one is also anonymous. It says, given the active disinformation measures amplifying the divisions within our societies and seeking to undermine our institutions, can the public have faith? Can they trust in a free and fair election this November?
Well, obviously the answer is yes. I think our elections are sound. I think that the decision-making of the electorate is reflected in the outcome of those elections. And I think that the infrastructure that we have is sound. Also, when we went through the last, Russian meddling issues, there were never any indications at all, and all the intelligence community reported this, that there was anything that was interfering with the infrastructure or the actual mechanisms of our voting. But I think one thing was important about that last question is the issue of really the tone and tenor of administrations, because the request of the Trump administration with respect to NATO and our allies is that they pay their fair share. And that was the same demand that George Bush had. It's the same demand that Obama had. When I served as president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, I was at the Warsaw NATO summit. That was the message from America then. Obama certainly was making that very clear. The difference is really saying that performance matters, that relationship matters, that NATO members and membership comes with some responsibility. When I first got involved in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly a decade ago, there were parliamentarians who would say they would go to their own country's floor And the debate would be, why should we increase military spending? We're in NATO. Well, now 10 years later, people are saying, well, we have to increase military spending because we're in NATO. They're recognizing that they have an obligation also. Disinformation is certainly an important aspect that really requires our discernment. People need to make certain that they're listening to a wide range of news sources, because there is so much fake news. And I can tell you, being on the Intelligence Committee, I open newspaper after newspaper and watch broadcast after broadcast that do not reflect the briefings that we have just received. And I've made this point to reporters that it is against the law for someone to receive a classified briefing and to tell what they received in that classified briefing. It is not against the law for someone to receive a classified briefing and to lie about what happened. And so there are those that have agendas, that have purposes that are other than just the veracity of what is occurring. And I think we have to be able to root that out by making certain that we're getting our information from many different sources.
So, Congressman, that leads me to want to ask about a current news story in the US. We have various news outlets reporting that US intelligence shared with the White House reports of Russian military intelligence offering and, in fact, paying bounties to Taliban-linked militants to kill US and coalition troops in Afghanistan. This raises issues: trust of the news media, trust of our intelligence community, trust of the White House to protect US and coalition troops. Would you just speak to this, given how much you know about these?
Well, first of all, let's take the accusation itself. I mean, it is abhorrent, obviously, and I think it shows that, with respect to Russia, we know that they are a self-declared adversary to both the United States, our NATO allies. They behave in that way. They are destructive and disruptive force. Their invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea clearly shows their lack of a validation of the world order and the way in which people have self-determination, certainly what we want every nation to aspire to. And with respect to intelligence, we don't know what the intelligence is. I'm always amazed at how there will be a report, and I was just reading CNN's about what was or was not in the president's briefing, and they reported it as if what they were stating was truth. Well, they don't know what the truth is. I mean, they are receiving a report from an unnamed source, an individual, and I think with those we should always be suspect. Now, obviously, this raises to the highest levels of decision making and of policy making as we evaluate what really is the information that we received, what is the relationship between Russia and the Taliban, what information have we received that is actionable, that we need to bring to the world dialogue about Russian behavior. But I think this is an excellent example of how we are going to read a number of reports that are going to tell you that they know what's in this information, that what's in the intelligence reports, and what information the president received. And in fact, they don't. They're getting the second hand, third hand. And it would certainly be a whole lot more helpful for the discussion if they would acknowledge much more frequently the speculative nature of the information that they're reporting. But nonetheless, this is absolutely going to be of the highest priority as we get to the bottom of what do we know and what has Russia been doing.
And you're sitting on two committees that will be directly involved in that. I mean, if
Yes.
there is in fact evidence of this, would there be further sanctions against Russia? What would you?
Well, I think, obviously we have to look at the whole range of what their actions are and what we're doing, but even more so, this comes directly to the issue of, there were attempts at negotiating peace with the Taliban, of trying to get a resolution of the issues in Afghanistan. I was just within the year I've been in Afghanistan, and I was asking our commanders there, we're trying to negotiate peace with a group that has obviously some control of some territory in Afghanistan. Are those in the areas in which they claim control? Are those areas peaceful? And the reports were, well, no, they're not. They're actually very violent. They're very murderous and very contentious. And my thought was, well, how do we negotiate a peace that changes the behavior of those who in their own areas where they control have significant violence and certainly not peace. It's going to be obviously the problem that continues to evolve for Afghanistan is how do we bring that area to some political and military conclusion.
So we are getting close to the end of this session, and I'd like to ask each of you one question and have you answer it from where you sit. And Mike, the overarching question is, if we can only build resilience if we have trust, whether that's trust within our societies, trust within our alliances, then how would you argue we most effectively rebuild trust in your area? So if the overarching aim is meaningful policy change, politicians delivering, in the area you're looking at, can you adapt structures? Do you need to reform them, or do you need to revolutionize them? Whether we're talking about police, whether we're talking about a European Union, whether we're talking about NATO. So I just would like to have each of you speak to that from where you sit. And Marc, Morial, let me start with you.
Yeah, so I think,
reform or revolutionize.
So I'm going to talk about the transatlantic relationship. So the most important element historically of the transatlantic relationship has been the relationship between the leaders of the nations in the transatlantic alliance, and the chemistry and the language and a reaffirmation that the transatlantic alliance is fundamentally important. Now, within that framework, there can be disagreements and differences about the role of NATO, the role of various multilateral relationships that might exist. There can be differences about the relationship with China or various Middle Eastern nations, but it has to be reaffirmed by the leadership. And in the United States, our commander-in-chief has felt that innuendo and personal criticism and mocking was the way to gain leverage in an arrangement to make people pay more. And I think that there's a sentiment that simply rejects that kind of approach to rebuilding the trusted relationship. It starts with the leadership in an international sphere. We don't vote in the United States for who the leaders of Germany or France or the United Kingdom or any of the other nations are. We vote for the president of the United States. And I think it's so important that that approach and that reaffirmation of the value is clear and communicated on a consistent basis, while understanding that there's going to be differences and friction from time to time. That's number one. On the domestic front, the role that the president plays in setting a tone in a diverse nation like we have, the presidency is a place where, yes, from time to time, the president's a political leader who plays partisan politics. No one's immune, but the presidency has to rise up to heal the nation, to bind the nation, to build bridges in times of great crisis. And I think that that's what has been lacking underneath it on these substantive issues of economic inequality or health disparities or access to the ballot, which has been assaulted by many. The expectation is that there needs to be substantive, meaningful policy changes. Some of it's been bottled up. Some of it has been thwarted and blocked for years. For example, a new Voting Rights Act has been thwarted for years. It would put to rest all of this suppression. It would put to rest all this purging. It would put to rest all of the kinds of shenanigans we've seen that have struck right dead set at the integrity of the American elections system. So we need substantive changes, but we need leadership that brings people together, that sets the proper tone, leadership that looks ahead to the future of the world, the future of the transatlantic alliance is nations that are more racially diverse, nations that live in a global economy where the European nations and the United States are not as super dominant economically as they once before, but have to maintain their moral voice in doing what is correct and what is right. So I think those are the challenges that we face in this period. But I think the trust has to be built with the chemistry, the language, the approach, the philosophy of the leaders of all of our nations in the transatlantic alliance. I think that's where it starts.
Congressman Turner, last word.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with what Marc has said. I mean, obviously, personal relationships and behavior and communication are incredibly important. But I do want to leave you with one thought, and that is, you know, there's a book that was written in 2018 called Factfulness, and it basically took some of our most basic beliefs or understandings of the status of the world and how bad things are and compared them to the way they are. I do think we have to start for having trust, to having some basis of understanding really how far we've come. I mean, this whole deliberative process that we have undertaken in democratic nations has had not only just peace and prosperity, but an unbelievable opening of freedoms. And this is a journey that we're taking and all taking together. So we have to recognize how far we've come. And two, we have to recognize that we all want to go there. We all are together in that. And I think, in these last George Floyd killing protests that we've had, that where the nation was shocked and as Marc so eloquently put, had such a visceral reaction to. There are those who have taken advantage of it, who, as Marc said, who inappropriately expressed violence, had other agendas other than ensuring that our police act appropriately and that people's rights be recognized. We need to be able to have the ability to discern those things as separate. When we talk about our policies, let's look at what we've done. Look at what we've done in the transatlantic relationship. It has been, in the past 4 years, greatly advanced. And then look at what those shared values as to where we are going, and try to separate out all the noise of those who might try to divide us. Thank you, Karen.
Sylvie Goulard.
No, one word you can find from outside, that Europe is slow, Europe is not perfect, Europe is not handling properly, etc. But we should think again where we were 70 years ago, where we had a cycle of world wars and calling the Americans to free us. So after the Second World War, we have invented some tools. They are not perfect, but they have provided decades of growth, prosperity, and cooperation. Okay, muddling through, no doubt, it's not perfect. I agree with Rosa, we need more democracy, but we need also better functioning democracy at the national level, which sometimes is one of the missing links in the European integration. So rule-based, multilateral, a feeling for global, and of course, not only diplomatic discussions, but involvement of the communities and the civil society. Thank you.
Terrific, thanks. And Rosa, please.
I'll be brief. You mentioned if the choice is adaptation or revolution, and I think what I'd like to do in Europe is turn things upside down so that one can actually rebuild democracy through trust, political participation in a bottom-up way, and figure out together what is the best and most legitimate way to govern public goods. And I think that would be the approach I would favor, precisely because of what Sylvie was also saying about the need to reconnect our democracies. It's not just about the EU, it's about what's happening at the national level and again, at the local level. And for me, the pandemic has just made this so obvious that I think this should be the debate about the future of Europe.
Well, a huge thank you to you four, because I will say I started this conversation feeling a bit depressed because I am quite worried about the erosion of trust and what that means for our ability to be resilient. But you've left me actually feeling inspired and reminding me that we all have agency in this, and there are many things we can do to create positive change. So I really appreciate your helping me close out our month of Brussels Forum. Thank you to everybody watching. It's been a remarkable Festival Ideas over this month. Thanks to wonderful speakers like these four. Thank you to my amazing colleagues headed by Nicola Leitner and Louise Langeby. Thank you to the tech folks who made this happen over a month. And I just want to remind everybody that you can watch all of the Brussels Forum sessions on YouTube. So if there are things you missed and want to catch up on, go to YouTube and you'll learn a lot. And you will also leave being inspired, I believe. So thank you, and I look forward to future engagements. Many, many thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You want to shut it off?
Yes, sir.